Welcome back to another alien bisecting and tribal collecting episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that blasts off to remote areas of the galaxy to chronicle its most dangerous and daring development stories. This week, we return to the hallowed hallways of Rare, whom I don't think I need to reintroduce for like the upteenth time, so I won't. I've covered them extensively in the past, and that's because many of their games just so happen to have very eventful development cycles, but fortunately, pretty much all of them came out the other side better for it, more or less. One of those games is of course our subject today, a spacefaring adventure featuring two siblings, a dog, a robot, and several metric tons of bug guts. So grab your plasma shotguns and cluster bombs as I answer the question, what happened to Jet Force Gemini? After work was completed on Rare's sorry but not sorry, explosively fun Blast Core in March of 1997, game designer Martin Wakely started coming up with ideas for a new project, eventually settling on the idea of a sci-fi blast-em-up. During this brainstorming period, a couple of different pitches were being thrown around, with one, funnily enough, being a return to a fairly obscure blip in Rare's history. Alien 8, a 1985 platform puzzler they had developed during their ultimate play the game days, was one of those early pitches, but was quickly dropped when the staff felt that starting fresh with a new IP was probably the more exciting choice, which I don't think many would begrudge them over. In terms of gameplay for inspiration, they looked towards the success of Nintendo's most recent software, as Rare often did, to get the ball properly rolling. In this case, much like the origins of Banjo-Kazooie once it transformed into a 3D platformer, it was Mario 64 that provided the model for how a character should move in 3 dimensions. But of course, the team would also need to come up with a new gameplay hook that would complement that, because in 1997, Rare had more than its fair share of platformers in development. As pre-production continued elsewhere within Rare, Diddy Kong Racing had just cruised into store shelves in November of '97, which freed up several other staff members to lend their talents to the burgeoning sci-fi blaster. Chief among these was Paul Mountain, a relatively new hire at Rare who became enthusiastic with the concept and quickly settled in as the project's lead programmer. It's here where things started taking concrete form. Early demo tests where a portly character was pit against wave after wave of cruel, disgusting, and exceedingly bloodthirsty frogs. And specifically frogs that were borrowed from Diddy Kong Racing's more waterlogged environments. This wasn't the only example of the young Kong's debut on the Nintendo being intrinsically entwined with Jet Force though, as there's going to be a few more instances of the team smartly reusing specific assets and technology from the fan-favorite racer. In a more broader sense, however, Paul Mountain, who was interviewed in issue 70 of Retro Gamer magazine, cited what other titles the team looked at for inspiration. It's fair to say that many games from the team's collective past influenced Jet Force Gemini, from 80s arcade classics right up to the most recent titles of the day. So, once the team were satisfied with the successful demos for the Husky Man vs. Demon Frogs, they started developing the concepts and gameplay out further, focusing on delivering both Mario-esque platforming and gun-blasting combat. However, as this melange began to marinate more and more, the team realized the project had a problem. A problem that would cause them to suddenly shift gears in their gameplay philosophy, level design, and development schedule. And unfortunately, this wouldn't be the only time this would happen. As revealed in the supplemental video material found in the Rare Replay collection as well as their YouTube channel, the Jet Force team started to feel that the combination of hopping across cliffs and ledges and popping caps wasn't working as well as they initially thought. Traditional 3D platformers often blurred their movement and combat systems together via things like jumping, spinning, or punching enemies, but in this early version of Jet Force, the player constantly needed to stop moving so they could blast nearby enemies, which, as you can imagine, slowed the pace down considerably. With that in mind, the team started to rethink their approach, and since there were already several jumpin' boppas in development elsewhere at Rare, they decided to focus more on the shooter aspect, as it would help the game stand out amongst its contemporaries. Now, when it came to the overall theme, the art direction, and world building, the Jet Force staff looked at pretty much everything sci-fi for inspiration. Star Wars, Dune, Aliens, and most interestingly of all, Battle of the Planets, aka G-Force, aka Eagle Riders, and finally, and most originally, aka Science Ninja Team Gatchaman. The staff, and certainly Rare artist Lee Musgrave, were taken with the brilliant white costumes and accent colors that the famous Tatsunoko characters were adorned with, and adopted a similar look for the brother-sister duo of Juno and Vela. Of course, this decision would have repercussions further down the line, but before we get to that, Jet Force Gemini was due for another big change in both scope and features that the team hadn't originally anticipated, especially as late as they were into the project. As previously stated, they had refocused Jet Force to be a pretty straightforward action shooter, but then, in November of 1998, Nintendo dropped a meek, inconspicuous little title called Ocarina of Time. Sarcasm aside, this release made an impact at Rare and the Jet Force team especially, as they felt their comparatively simple arcade-esque shooter might compare unfavorably with the length and value proposition offered by the latest Zelda epic. I was fortunate enough to speak briefly with Platonic's Paul Mountain, thanks for the hookup, Daily Kong, as to what exactly changed at this point in development. From an early stage, the game was intended to be an action shooter, akin to a 3D version of other character-based action shooters of the time, like Metroid. It was a large game where you upgraded your character and weaponry, but it is true that at a later stage a handful of more adventure-like elements were added, the most notable of which was ramping up the weapon collection, where weapons were found by opening large metal chests and awarded through an animated sequence, and we added some locked doors that needed to be blasted with sufficiently powerful weapons to unlock them. So even though they were on a tight schedule, the team felt like these additions would go a long way into improving the final product. In addition, all the other things they wanted to include initially, like different routes through each level depending on what character you played as, various multiplayer modes that range from the typical deathmatch to the very untypical Diddy Kong Racing-esque minigames, a unique drop-in, drop-out co-op mode with the second player taking control of the robotic Floyd, and finally, and most controversially, tribals. This race of furry little fuzzbutts shared some similarities with Banjo-Kazooie's Jinjos in that you absolutely needed to collect all of them. For those that are not privy to the lore and allure of these collectible creatures, the staff made it so that if you didn't gather 12 ship parts and save 282 hapless tribals, the game would end on a cliffhanger after a boss fight against the evil Mizar, who would escape before you could land the finishing blow. You were then told you needed to comb through all the previous levels to find everything you were missing, with different characters and different powers. And once that was done, which some have charitably described as a slog, a whole asteroid sequence, final boss fight, and true ending were attainable. Not exactly sure why Rare didn't make it so those parameters were outlined at, the very start so you could accomplish most of it along the way, but I have to assume it was to greatly pad out the game's length. It wasn't just about collecting the tribals though, because unlike Jinjos, these bottom shelf Ewoks were very fragile, in that any wayward gunfire or plasma blast could sometimes result in collateral damage, forcing you to restart the entire level all over again.
So you want collateral damage, huh?
Who the fuck are you?
I give you fucking collateral damage.
Hey, stop that!
Now, in issue 70 of Retro Gamer, Paul Mountain, who remains quite proud of what he and the team at Rare accomplished with Jet Force, did admit that they may have gone a little overboard with this particular design choice. From a personal viewpoint, if I approached this today, I would definitely be more forgiving on the requirement to save all the tribals before being able to progress to the game finale. While Lee Musgrave, in the same interview, agreed. This feature was actually a late addition to the way the game played and was quite a brutal stroke for us to play at such a late stage. I'm not sure we would make the same move again. This last-minute addition to the game's scope wasn't really known to anyone outside of Rare's offices at the time. But what people very much did notice was that between E3 1999, where Jet Force was first shown, and its eventual release, Juno and Vela underwent somewhat of a sudden transformation, which has remained a long-standing and confusing point of contention ever since. Like many other games from Rare's past, and in sharp contrast to their current tenure under Microsoft, Nintendo was mostly hands-off with Jet Force, as explained by Paul Mountain to Retro Gamer. Nintendo took regular looks at the game during development, and we listened to any feedback they gave us, but it was essentially a Rare-developed title. There was one instance, however, where Nintendo or someone felt that a change was in order for Jet Force, and that was the design of its main protagonists. Seemingly overnight, Juno and Vela went from youthful, big-headed superheroes to something more akin to space soldiers, which made for a pretty drastic switch. Now, over the years, there's been multiple fingers pointed at multiple parties for this change, ranging from feedback received from a vague focus group of gamers, Nintendo for feeling that childlike characters shooting guns was a bad look, and finally Shigeru Miyamoto himself, who simply didn't like Juno and Vela's original designs and let Rare know it. Here, Paul Mountain chimed in once again to set the record straight as to who exactly mandated the redesign. There's some element of truth to most of those rumors, but the main reason was just that the art director and art team were not completely happy with the way that the early characters looked once the game had progressed, so the main protagonists were given an overhaul to make them more fitting to the look and feel of the final game. So, there you have it, the mystery of Juno and Vela's extreme makeover finally solved. Along with that 11th hour change, the team were still also working feverishly, sometimes 70 to 80 hour weeks, trying to cram in all the other additional features before its rapidly upcoming release date. So it was all hands on deck for August of 1999, which then turned into September and then finally to October. These two delays put the game dangerously close to overlapping the release of Donkey Kong 64, which had its own set of problems which you can learn about in this video here. But fortunately, since Perfect Dark had received a lengthy delay into 2000, it left a little breathing room for the JFG team. And like DK64, Jet Force also happened to run afoul the cursed peripheral that is the N64 expansion pack. In the last year of Jet Force's development, the team were considering using that girthy 4 megs of extra RAM for possible technical improvements, but decided against it soon after, a decision that I guess wasn't communicated very well with Nintendo. When the first run of cartridges shipped to stores in October, the packaging clearly stated it had expansion pack compatibility, even though it absolutely didn't. Although the pack was due to be released with Donkey Kong 64, it remains something that all N64 owners would not necessarily have access to. We wanted to deliver the same experience to all players, and were confident that we could do this using the standard 4 megabytes of RAM on the console. This decision allowed us to focus all our efforts on getting everything we wanted working on an unexpanded console, and I firmly believe we were able to do this. Lee Musgrave shed even more light on this subject with a certain amount of swagger. It would have made the production costs go up and the release timescale less favorable. We were confident that we could graphically outdo many games that were using the pack regardless. We were right. Nintendo, being the publisher, initially employed a very quick fix using stickers that hid the mistake and instead touted Rumble Pack capability, which was accurate, and then corrected the error later on in future production runs. Man, if I had a nickel for every time there was some sort of kerfuffle with Rare games and the expansion pack, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but you know the rest. Anyway, when Jet Force Gemini did finally release across the globe, even in Japan, where it was renamed to Star Twins, it received almost universal praise for its graphics, sound, and explosive action. Some outlets, however, took issue with having to collect tribals, the spotty performance, especially in multiplayer, and the game's combat control scheme, which, to its credit, was one of the earliest attempts at an over-the-shoulder style perspective in a third-person shooter. So it was somewhat clunky. But despite the mostly glowing reviews, commercially Jet Force's reception wasn't as chill or as positive as one would hope. Perhaps due to the delays, the character design, or DK64, which was released only 1 month later, Jet Force Gemini only managed to shift around 1 million copies. Wait, which is really good? Yeah, I mean, for a brand new IP in 1999 or even today, depending on the budget, that's nothing to scoff at, but the problem was that Rare had already set the bar extremely high for their N64 output, as they were second only to Nintendo in terms of blockbuster software. By comparison, Banjo 1 shifted over 3 million, Diddy Kong Racing 4 million, DK64 5 million, and the mighty GoldenEye had over 8 million copies. So in terms of units sold, especially at the time of release, Jet Force Gemini was one of their lowest performing. It shouldn't be a surprise then that it, alongside KI Gold and Blast Corps, were all franchises that never received any kind of sequel under Rare's banner. In fact, much of the team who worked on Jet Force immediately moved on to developing Mickey's Speedway USA instead, which, you know, fun little game, but one whose existence I find myself being reminded of roughly every decade. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the obscure Game Boy Color iteration of Jet Force Gemini, which nobody even knew about until around 2010, as it was unceremoniously cancelled and never even officially announced to be a thing. This was one of, if not the only project that Rare had ever outsourced to another studio, which was to their fellow Brits over at Bits Studios, who were responsible for such titles as Die Hard Vendetta, Rogue Ops, and of course the SNES version of Wolverine Adamantium Rage. Wolverine. Anyway, the game was to take place in an isometric perspective, and would have seen Juno and Lupus on a rescue mission to save Vela from a mysterious planet. There's been no definitive reason behind the cancellation, but the most common theory seems to be the poor retail performance of Rare's previous 2 GBC ports of Perfect Dark and Conker's Pocket Tales, which discouraged them from supporting the platform any further. Sadly, that's the last we've heard of Jet Force Gemini outside of the updated HD port in the Rare Replay collection, which I will now once again shill because it's absolutely fantastic and has 102% of your daily recommended dose of googly eyes. And while this particular adventure was certainly not the most popular in Rare's back catalog, it remains perhaps its most innovative, with the strides it took to evolve third-person shooters and establishing the dichotomy of starry-eyed youths being bathed in the gore and viscera of slavering insectoid aliens. Thanks again to Paul Mountain for sharing his insight into today's video. And if you know of any other galaxy-spanning development stories in the video game or movie industries, let me know in the comments below or take a quick jetpack ride over into my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!